My name is Alex, and for 20 years, I believed I had married the love of my life. Isabella was everything I could have dreamed of: intelligent, elegant, and endlessly ambitious. We met at a party during our university years, a time when I was still finding my footing in life, and she already seemed destined for greatness. Her charm was magnetic, and before I knew it, we were inseparable. Our relationship felt like a partnership built on mutual respect and trust. When I proposed, it wasn't just to Isabella, it was to her world. She came from an affluent family, the Devereaux, whose influence reached every corner of the business world. Marrying Isabella meant stepping into a life far beyond anything I had known, and I worked tirelessly to prove that I belonged. I loved her deeply, and I thought we were building something unshakable. Our wedding was a grand affair orchestrated by her parents, Richard and Evelyn. It was clear from the beginning that they saw me as an outsider, someone who wasn't quite worthy of their daughter. But Isabella assured me that none of that mattered. She chose me, and that was enough. Or so I thought. After the wedding, we moved into her family's sprawling estate. It wasn't ideal for me. I valued independence, but I told myself it was temporary. I wanted to make Isabella happy, even if it meant sacrificing a bit of my comfort. Those first few months felt like a dream. Isabella and I were partners in every sense of the word, or at least that's what I believed. Little did I know, cracks were already forming beneath the surface. After the wedding, I quickly realized that being part of the Devereux family came with expectations. Expectations I wasn't sure I could ever fulfill. Moving into their mansion felt less like a homecoming and more like stepping into a gilded cage. The estate was grand, sprawling across acres with perfectly manicured gardens and a towering facade that screamed wealth and power. It was their sanctuary, not mine. Richard and Evelyn Devereux were always polite but distant. They had a way of making me feel like I was a guest in their world, rather than a part of the family. Richard, with his sharp suits and sharper words, treated me like a necessary inconvenience. Evelyn was no better, her smile never reaching her eyes when she spoke to me. Still, I convinced myself that their approval didn't matter. I was married to Isabella, not her parents, but their influence on her was undeniable. They had always envisioned a certain life for her, one filled with success, prestige, and the continuation of their legacy. Shortly after the wedding, they began subtly pressing us about starting a family. Evelyn, with her ever-present air of superiority, would casually drop comments like, "Isabella, dear, it's about time you thought about giving Richard and me a grandchild. Don't you agree, Alex?" At first, I laughed it off. Isabella and I had talked about having children someday, but we wanted to wait until we were both ready. Or so I thought. It wasn't long before I noticed Isabella's unease whenever the topic came up. She would deflect, change the subject, or excuse herself from the conversation entirely. As the weeks turned into months, I couldn't ignore the tension that began creeping into our relationship. Isabella started spending more time at work, and when she was home, she seemed distant. The affectionate woman I had fallen in love with was becoming a stranger before my eyes. She still smiled, but it lacked the warmth I once knew. She still talked to me, but her words felt rehearsed, as though she was performing a role rather than sharing her true thoughts. I chalked it up to the pressure from her parents. After all, being a Devereux came with a heavy weight, and I assumed she was simply overwhelmed. I tried to support her the best I could, offering to talk to Richard and Evelyn on her behalf, but she always refused. "It's fine, Alex," she would say with a tight smile. "I can handle them." What I didn't know was that her growing distance had nothing to do with her parents and everything to do with someone else. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, Isabella's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and immediately flipped it over, her expression unreadable. "Work," she muttered when I asked about it, but something about her tone felt off. It wasn't the first time she'd done that, and I was beginning to notice a pattern. The late nights at the office, the secretive phone calls, the way she'd suddenly light up when a text came through, only to mask it with indifference when she caught me looking. It was subtle at first, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. The woman I had married was keeping something from me, and for the first time in our relationship, I felt the sting of doubt. Still, I tried to push those thoughts away. This was Isabella, the woman who had chosen me despite her family's disapproval. The woman who had stood by me when I felt out of place in her world. She wouldn't betray me. She couldn't. But deep down, a seed of uncertainty had been planted, and it was beginning to grow. The late nights became a pattern, one I couldn't ignore any longer. Isabella's excuses were always the same. We're finalizing a deal, or Leo needs my input on a new project. At first, I believed her. She was ambitious and dedicated, traits I had always admired. But the more distant she became, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just the late nights. It was the way she acted when she was home. Isabella would smile at me, but it never reached her eyes. Her touch, once so warm and reassuring, felt mechanical, as if she was going through the motions of being a wife. I told myself I was overthinking, that the pressure from her parents and her demanding job were the reasons for her behavior. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I stumbled across a photo that made my stomach drop. It was a candid shot of Isabella and Leo, her business partner, at an industry event. They stood close, too close. His hand rested on the small of her back, and the way they looked at each other sent a chill down my spine. The caption was innocent enough, something about networking and building connections, but the intimacy in their body language was undeniable. I couldn't confront her without solid proof, so I started paying closer attention. I began noticing little things. How she would light up when her phone buzzed, how she'd excuse herself to take calls in another room, and how she seemed to avoid eye contact when I asked about her day. Then, one night, she came home later than usual. Her makeup was slightly smudged, and there was a faint hint of cologne on her clothes that wasn't mine. When I asked how her meeting went, she hesitated before replying, "It was fine. Just a long day." Her voice wavered, and I knew she was lying. I couldn't keep ignoring the signs, so I decided to follow her. The next time she claimed she had a late meeting, I waited until she left and then got into my car. I kept a safe distance as I tailed her to what I assumed would be her office. But instead of heading downtown, she drove to a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of town. I parked a few spaces away and watched as she stepped out of her car, adjusting her dress before walking inside. I waited, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to storm in and confront her, to demand an explanation for why she was here. But another part of me, a quieter, more cautious part, told me to wait. I needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. After what felt like an eternity, I saw her through the restaurant's window. She was seated at a small table, and across from her was Leo. They laughed together, leaning in close as if the rest of the world didn't exist. My chest tightened, and I felt a mix of anger and heartbreak. This wasn't just a professional meeting. This was something else entirely. I stayed in my car, watching as they shared a meal and exchanged smiles that once belonged to me. When they finally left, they didn't part ways. Instead, they walked to his car, and I saw him place a hand on her back, guiding her inside. The sight was like a punch to the gut. I didn't sleep that night. My mind raced with questions and scenarios, each more painful than the last. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I knew I needed more than just my suspicions. If I was going to face her, I needed undeniable proof. The next morning, I decided to hire a private investigator. It felt drastic, but I couldn't bear the thought of living in the dark any longer. If Isabella was betraying me, I needed to know. I needed to hear it from someone who could give me the cold, hard truth. Days turned into weeks as the investigator gathered evidence. He sent me photos of Isabella and Leo at various locations, restaurants, hotels, even parks where they strolled hand in hand. Each image felt like a knife to the heart, but they also gave me clarity. There was no denying it anymore. Isabella was having an affair. I wanted to confront her that night, but something held me back. I stared at the photos, each one a testament to her betrayal, and felt a surge of anger mixed with sadness. This wasn't the woman I married. The Isabella the first knew would never have done this. But the Isabella in those photos was someone else entirely. I knew I had to confront her eventually, but for now, I needed time to process everything. I needed to prepare myself for the inevitable fallout. Deep down, I knew that this was just the beginning of the end. The weight of betrayal sat heavy on my chest as I paced the living room, clutching the folder of damning evidence. Photos, timestamps, and receipts. All of it laid bare the truth I tried so hard to deny. Tonight, I couldn't stay silent any longer. I had to confront Isabella, no matter how much it hurt. When the door finally opened and she walked in, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, I forced myself to stay calm. She looked up, startled to see me waiting for her. "You're up late," she said, her voice light but guarded. She set her purse down on the counter and began to loosen her scarf, avoiding my gaze. "We need to talk," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. She froze for a moment, then turned to face me. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, fear, guilt, or maybe both, but she quickly masked it with a practiced smile. "About what?" she asked innocently, but her voice wavered slightly. I placed the folder on the table between us. "About this," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the folder. Slowly, she reached for it and opened it. As she flipped through the photos and documents, her expression shifted from confusion to horror. She slammed the folder shut and glared at me. "You had me followed," she spat, her voice dripping with indignation. "You're angry that I had you followed?" I shot back. "Not that you've been cheating on me with Leo for months?" Her face flushed, and for a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. Then, she straightened her shoulders, her expression hardening. "I wasn't cheating," she said defensively. "Leo and we've just been spending time together. It's not what you think." I laughed bitterly, unable to believe her audacity. "Spending time together?" I repeated, pointing to the folder. "Is that what you call secret dinners, hand-holding in the park, and sneaking off to hotels? Don't insult my intelligence, Isabella." She opened her mouth to respond but then closed it, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Finally, she sighed and sank into the nearest chair. "Fine," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "You're right. I've been seeing him." Her confession hit me like a sledgehammer, even though I'd already known the truth. Hearing her say it out loud made it real, and the pain was almost unbearable. "Why?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why would you do this to me? To us?" She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know," she whispered. I felt suffocated. The expectations, the pressure. I needed an escape." "An escape?" I repeated, my anger rising. "You had an affair because you felt suffocated? Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To our marriage?" Tears spilled down her cheeks, but I felt no sympathy. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "It just happened." "It just happened?" I said, my voice rising. "Affairs don't just happen, Isabella. You made a choice. A selfish, destructive choice." She buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. For a moment, I felt a pang of pity, but it was quickly overshadowed by the anger and betrayal coursing through me. "I trusted you," I said, my voice low and cold. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I've hurt you, but I never stopped loving you." "Love?" I scoffed. "Don't talk to me about love. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this." She reached out to me, but I stepped back, shaking my head. "Don't," I said firmly. "You don't get to play the victim here." Silence hung heavy between us as she sat there, her hands trembling in her lap. Finally, I spoke again. "I can't do this anymore, Isabella. I can't be with someone who betrayed me like this." Her eyes widened in panic. "Alex, please," she begged. "We can work through this. I'll end it with Leo. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." But her words felt hollow, and I knew they couldn't erase the damage she'd done. "It's too late," I said, my voice firm. "You've made your choice, and now I'm making mine. I want a divorce." Her face crumpled as the reality of my words sank in. She tried to argue, to plead with me, but I was done. The trust between us was shattered, and there was no putting it back together. I turned and walked away, leaving her sitting there, sobbing into her hands. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I felt a strange sense of relief. The confrontation had been painful, but it was also liberating. For the first time in months, I felt like I was reclaiming control of my life. The morning after our confrontation, I woke up with a newfound sense of clarity. The decision to end my marriage to Isabella wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I couldn't keep pretending that things could go back to the way they were. Trust, once broken, is almost impossible to repair, and with everything I'd uncovered, there was no room for reconciliation. The woman I thought I'd grow old with was no longer the person I married. I reached out to my attorney, Jason, someone I trusted implicitly. He had handled a few of my business contracts in the past, but this time, the stakes were far more personal. When I called him, he didn't sound surprised. "Alex," he said, his voice calm but direct, "you've been holding this in for too long. Let's handle this quickly and make sure you walk away with everything you deserve." I explained the situation, laying out every painful detail. Isabella's affair, her deception, and the way she and her family had always tried to undermine me. Jason listened carefully, asking questions when necessary, and assured me that we'd approach this strategically. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll make sure she doesn't take advantage of you any further." That same afternoon, I sat in Jason's office, reviewing the divorce papers he'd prepared. As I signed the documents, a strange mixture of emotions coursed through me: anger, sadness, and, most surprisingly, relief. I was finally taking control of my life, refusing to let Isabella or her betrayal define me. When I got home, Isabella was waiting for me in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She must have sensed that something was coming because she stood up the moment I walked in, her hands clasped nervously. "Alex, can we talk?" she asked, her voice tentative. I held up the envelope containing the divorce papers. "There's nothing left to talk about," I said, placing it on the coffee table. "These are the divorce papers. I suggest you read them carefully." Her eyes widened in shock, and she reached for the envelope with trembling hands. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We've been together for 20 years. You can't just throw it all away." I crossed my arms, keeping my voice steady. "I'm not the one who threw it away, Isabella. You did that the moment you decided to betray me." Tears welled up in her eyes as she clutched the envelope to her chest. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I hurt you, but we can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." Her desperation might have moved me once, but not anymore. I had given her everything: my love, my trust, and 2 decades of my life. She had chosen to gamble it all for the thrill of an affair, and now she was facing the consequences. "It's too late for that," I said firmly. "You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing into her hands. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I knew better. I couldn't let her manipulate me with her tears. Instead, I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her to process the reality of what was happening. In the days that followed, Isabella tried every tactic to change my mind. She left me tearful voicemails, begging for another chance. She sent long, apologetic texts, promising to end things with Leo and focus on rebuilding our marriage. She even enlisted her parents, Richard and Evelyn, to intervene on her behalf. Richard called me one evening, his voice dripping with condescension. "Alex, let's be reasonable," he said. "Isabella made a mistake, but you've been a part of this family for 20 years. Don't throw that away over a lapse in judgment." I clenched my jaw, barely able to contain my frustration. "With all due respect, Richard," I said, "this isn't about a lapse in judgment. It's about betrayal. Your daughter made her choice, and I've made mine." He sighed, clearly annoyed. "You're being stubborn," he said. "Think about what this will do to our family." "Our family?" I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. "You've never considered me part of your family, Richard. And frankly, I'm done pretending to be something I'm not." I hung up before he could respond, feeling a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I was standing up for myself, refusing to let Isabella or her family dictate my life. The divorce process was grueling, as I expected. Isabella contested every detail, from the division of assets to the ownership of our home. She tried to paint herself as the victim, claiming that I had neglected her and driven her into Leo's arms. But Jason was prepared, and with the evidence we'd gathered, her lies quickly unraveled. When the court finally ruled in my favor, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The marriage that had once been my greatest source of joy had become a prison, and now I was free. Free to rebuild my life on my own terms, without the shadow of betrayal looming over me. The ink on the divorce ruling was barely dry when the onslaught began. Isabella's parents, Richard and Evelyn, decided they weren't done meddling in my life. They'd already tried to guilt-trip me during the proceedings, but now their tactics escalated. It started with a polite email from Evelyn, which read more like a condescending reprimand. "Alex, we're deeply disappointed in how you've handled this situation. We expected better from you, given all the opportunities we've provided you through our family's connections. Please reconsider your actions for the sake of preserving what's left of our family's dignity." I didn't bother replying. What dignity was she talking about? Their daughter's affair had already shattered any illusion of that. A few days later, Richard called me directly. His tone wasn't just stern. It was threatening. "Alex, let's cut to the chase," he began. "You've embarrassed this family enough. You think you've won, but you'll regret crossing us. We have the resources to make your life very difficult." I leaned back in my chair, letting him rant. It was clear he was trying to intimidate me, but I wasn't the same man I had been months ago. I wasn't afraid of Richard's wealth or influence anymore. "Richard," I said calmly, "you might want to save your threats for someone who cares. I've already lost everything I thought mattered. There's nothing you can take from me now." That silenced him, at least temporarily, but the phone calls didn't stop. Evelyn left a tearful voicemail a few days later, begging me to do the right thing and take Isabella back. I couldn't tell if she was genuinely concerned for her daughter or just worried about the family's public image. Probably the latter. The final straw came when they showed up at my house unannounced. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the middle of sorting through old photos and documents, trying to declutter my life. The knock at the door startled me, and when I opened it, there they were, Richard in his tailored suit, Evelyn clutching her designer handbag like it was a lifeline. "Alex," Evelyn started, her voice trembling, "we need to talk." I stepped aside, letting them in, but I didn't offer them a seat. They stood awkwardly in the living room, clearly unaccustomed to being in a home that didn't exude luxury. Richard wasted no time getting to the point. "You need to drop this divorce nonsense," he said firmly. "Reconcile with Isabella. We'll ensure she ends her relationship with Leo, and we can all move forward as a family." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "Are you serious?" I asked. "You think I'd just forget everything? Pretend like she didn't betray me?" Evelyn stepped forward, her voice soft and pleading. "People make mistakes, Alex. You and Isabella have been together for so long. Don't throw it all away over a temporary lapse in judgment." I couldn't hold back my anger any longer. "A lapse in judgment?" I repeated, my voice rising. "She didn't trip and fall into an affair, Evelyn. She made a choice. Over and over again. And now you're asking me to clean up her mess because you're worried about how it looks for your family?" Richard's face turned red, his composure slipping. "You're being unreasonable," he snapped. "We've done so much for you, Alex. We gave you opportunities you never would have had on your own. And this is how you repay us?" I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Let me make something clear," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I don't owe you or your family anything. If anything, I'm the one who's been used, by Isabella, by you, by all of it. And I'm done." Evelyn started to protest, but I cut her off. "This conversation is over. You can see yourselves out." They left in a huff, muttering under their breath about how ungrateful I was. As the door closed behind them, I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. They had tried to break me, but I was still standing. For the first time in years, I felt like I was truly in control of my life. Later that evening, I received a text from Isabella. "I'm sorry about my parents. They mean well, but they just want what's best for everyone." I didn't bother replying. It didn't matter what she or her parents wanted anymore. I was done playing their game, and I wasn't going to let them manipulate me into going back. I had already started to rebuild my life, and I wasn't about to let them drag me down again. Days after the confrontational visit from Isabella's parents, I found myself sitting in the quiet of my small kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. My thoughts kept drifting back to the tangled mess of betrayal, anger, and manipulation I'd been forced to endure. I wasn't just fighting Isabella anymore. I was battling her parents' influence and their seemingly endless resources. It was time to shift the balance of power. That's when the idea struck me. Leo. Leo was the catalyst for all of this. The man Isabella had chosen to betray me with. At first, the thought of reaching out to him disgusted me, but the more I considered it, the more it made sense. If anyone could provide me with the ammunition I needed to fight back, it was him. He might have been complicit in the affair, but I suspected he was just another pawn in Isabella's game, as I had been. I spent the next few days gathering my courage. Contacting Leo wasn't going to be easy, but I knew it was necessary. Eventually, I found his email address through a bit of careful online searching. My message was simple but direct. Subject ***, we need to talk. Leo, you don't know me, but I think you can guess who this is. I'm not here to fight or accuse you. I just want to have a conversation, man to man. What's done is done, but there's a bigger picture here, and I think you know what I'm talking about. Let me know if you're willing to meet. To my surprise, he replied within hours. His response was cautious but polite. I wasn't expecting this. I'll meet you, but only to talk. No drama. Tell me where and when. We agreed to meet at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. As I sat waiting for him, my mind raced with questions. Would he come clean? Would he try to defend himself? Or worse, would he try to justify what he and Isabella had done? The door chimed, and there he was, Leo, the man who had upended my life. He approached the table with a nervous smile, his posture tense. Alex, he said, extending a hand. I shook it briefly, more out of politeness than anything else. He sat down across from me, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of the situation hanging heavily between us. I wasn't sure you'd actually show up, I said, breaking the silence. He shrugged, looking down at his coffee. I figured I owed you that much. I leaned forward, my tone firm but calm. Let's not waste time, Leo. I need to know the truth about you and Isabella. All of it. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but eventually, the words started spilling out. Look, I didn't mean for any of this to happen, he began. It started out as just work. She was charming, you know? Confident, driven. She made me feel important. I clenched my fists under the table, struggling to keep my emotions in check. And you didn't think about the fact that she was married? That I existed? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know it doesn't excuse anything, but she told me your marriage was already falling apart, that you were distant, that you didn't care about her anymore. I believed her. Did she also tell you she was using you? I asked sharply, because that's exactly what happened. Leo's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of doubt in his expression. What are you talking about? I pulled out my phone and showed him the screenshots I had taken, the messages between Isabella and her parents, the ones where they discussed leveraging Leo to advance their business interests. His face paled as he read through them. She used me to get ahead, he murmured, more to himself than to me. All that talk about leaving you, about starting fresh, it was all a lie. For the first time, I saw the cracks in his facade. He wasn't the confident, charming man Isabella had described. He was just as much a victim of her manipulation as I had been. I need your help, Leo, I said, my tone softening slightly. I'm fighting a battle I can't win on my own. Her parents have money, power, and connections. But if we work together, we can expose the truth. He hesitated, clearly torn. Why should I trust you? Because I'm the only one who's telling you the truth right now, I replied. Isabella and her family have been playing both of us. If we don't stand up to them, they'll keep doing it to others. After a long pause, he nodded. All right, I'll help you. But this doesn't mean I forgive myself for what I did to you. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Leo, I said. I'm asking for your honesty. Over the next few days, Leo and I worked together to gather as much evidence as possible. He provided emails, text messages, and even voice recordings that painted a damning picture of Isabella's actions. It was uncomfortable, even humiliating, to see just how deep her betrayal went, but it also gave me the ammunition I needed to fight back. As I walked away from our final meeting, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in months. The truth was finally on my side, and for the first time, I felt like I had a real chance at justice. The evidence Leo provided was a goldmine. It was more than enough to turn the tables on Isabella and her family. As I sat at my desk, reviewing the screenshots, voice recordings, and emails, I felt a surge of determination. For too long, I had been painted as the weak, disposable husband, someone they could manipulate and discard. But now, I had the upper hand, and I wasn't going to waste it. The next step was deciding how to release the information. I didn't want to destroy Isabella out of spite, but I also couldn't let her or her family walk away without consequences. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity and ensuring that the truth came to light. I contacted my lawyer, Lisa, to discuss the legal ramifications of what I was about to do. She was a no-nonsense professional, and she had been my rock throughout the divorce proceedings. When I showed her the evidence, her eyes widened. "This is damning, Alex," she said, flipping through the files. "With this, you can not only protect yourself in the divorce, but also expose the corruption within her family's business. Are you ready for the fallout?" I nodded. I've been ready since the day she admitted to the affair. It's time they faced the consequences. Lisa helped me draft a plan. We decided to release the information strategically. First, I would send the evidence to Isabella's business partners and clients. Then, I would leak the recordings and emails to a few trusted journalists. The goal wasn't to humiliate her, but to ensure that her actions, and those of her family, were exposed to the world. The night before the plan went into motion, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the life Isabella and I had built together, the promises we had made, and how easily she had thrown it all away. Part of me still wanted to believe that the woman I had fallen in love with was somewhere inside her, but the evidence suggested otherwise. She had chosen power and ambition over love, and now she would have to live with the consequences. The following morning, I pressed send on the emails. One by one, the truth began to ripple through Isabella's professional and personal circles. Her clients started pulling out of deals, her business partners demanded explanations, and her carefully curated reputation began to crumble. The journalists I had contacted wasted no time publishing articles that detailed her affair, her manipulation of Leo, and her family's corrupt practices. The backlash was immediate. Isabella's phone must have been ringing off the hook, but I didn't answer when she called me. Instead, I sat back and watched as the empire she and her family had built began to crack under the weight of their lies. That evening, I received a call from Richard, Isabella's father. His voice, usually calm and condescending, was frantic. "Alex, we need to talk. This smear campaign you've started, it's going to ruin us." "It's not a smear campaign, Richard," I replied coldly. "It's the truth. Maybe if you and your family had been honest, you wouldn't be in this position." "Be reasonable," he pleaded. "Think about how this affects everyone involved. Isabella made mistakes, but we can fix this. Just tell me what you want." I almost laughed at the irony. After months of threats and intimidation, Richard was now the one begging for mercy. "What I want," I said, "is for you to take responsibility for your actions. But we both know that's never going to happen." Before he could respond, I hung up. It felt good to finally stand up to him, to reclaim the power he and his family had tried to strip from me. The next few days were a whirlwind. News of the scandal spread like wildfire, and Isabella's world continued to unravel. Her business was in shambles, her social circle had turned against her, and her family's name was tarnished beyond repair. She tried to reach out to me, leaving voicemail after voicemail, but I deleted each one without listening. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of closure. The truth was out, and I no longer felt like a victim. Isabella and her family had underestimated me, and now they were paying the price. As I sat in my quiet apartment that night, I realized that this wasn't just a victory over Isabella. It was a victory for myself. I had faced betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak, but I had come out stronger. I was finally free from her manipulation, and I could start to rebuild my life on my own terms. The aftermath of the revelations was nothing short of catastrophic, for Isabella and her family. That is, for me, it was a strange, bittersweet experience watching their empire crumble under the weight of their lies. For years, they had operated as if they were untouchable, but now the public had turned against them, and no amount of wealth or influence could undo the damage. Isabella's business suffered the most immediate consequences. Clients pulled out of contracts, partners severed ties, and the company's stock plummeted. I heard through mutual acquaintances that her office had been a frenzy of panic and desperation. Employees were jumping ship, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. The once impressive woman who had built her career on charm and deceit was now scrambling to salvage what little she could. As for her parents, Richard and Evelyn, their influence in the business world evaporated almost overnight. Major clients and investors began distancing themselves, worried about their own reputations. Richard tried to fight back, claiming the allegations were false and that the evidence had been fabricated, but no one believed him. The truth was too damning, and his credibility was in shreds. Despite their fall from grace, Richard and Evelyn still had the audacity to reach out to me. Richard called one evening, his voice desperate and pleading. "Alex, let's be reasonable. This doesn't have to go any further," he said, as if he still held any power over me. "We can work something out, find a way to fix this mess." I couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction as I listened to him grovel. For years, he had treated me like an outsider, a mere inconvenience in his daughter's life. Now, he was the one begging for a lifeline. "There's nothing to fix, Richard," I replied, my tone calm but firm. "You and your family made your choices, and now you're dealing with the consequences. Don't call me again." I hung up before he could respond. It was a small act, but it felt like reclaiming a piece of my dignity. Isabella, on the other hand, wasn't as persistent. After her initial attempts to contact me, she seemed to accept that I wasn't going to respond. But that didn't stop her from trying to manipulate the narrative. She gave a tearful interview to a local news outlet, framing herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She claimed she had made mistakes, but insisted that she was being unfairly targeted. The interview didn't go over well. The public wasn't buying her performance, especially after the evidence I had released. Comment sections and social media were flooded with criticism, calling her out for her hypocrisy and entitlement. The sympathy she had hoped for never materialized. As the chaos unfolded, I focused on myself. I started going to therapy, not just to process the betrayal, but to understand how I had allowed myself to be treated so poorly for so long. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was necessary. I realized that I had spent years trying to prove my worth to people who would never value me. Letting go of that need for validation was liberating. I also began reconnecting with old friends and family. For months, I had isolated myself, ashamed of what had happened and unsure of how to face the world. But now, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. These were the people who had stood by me when everything fell apart, and I owed it to them, and to myself, to rebuild those relationships. One evening, I met up with my best friend, Mark, at our favorite bar. We hadn't seen each other in months, and it felt good to catch up without the weight of my past dragging me down. "You look better, man," Mark said, raising his glass. "Like you finally got your spark back." I smiled, realizing he was right. "It's been a long road, but I'm getting there." He nodded, his expression serious. "You deserve this, Alex. You've been through hell, but you came out stronger. Don't let anyone take that from you." His words stuck with me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my life. The pain of Isabella's betrayal hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined me. I was moving forward, and that was all that mattered. As I walked home that night, I thought about everything I had lost and gained. Over the past few months, the life I had built with Isabella was gone, but so was the weight of her manipulation and deceit. In its place was a newfound sense of freedom and self-worth. The fallout from the scandal continued to ripple through Isabella's world, but I no longer cared. Her actions had destroyed her life, not mine. I was finally free, and I wasn't looking back. The day the divorce was finalized felt like the closing of a heavy, rusted door. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the end of years spent under the shadow of people who had never truly valued me. Standing outside the courthouse, I took a deep breath, letting the weight of everything I'd endured fall away. For the first time in a long time, I felt light, free. My life after Isabella became a journey of rediscovery. I moved out of the house we had shared and found a place of my own, a modest apartment that felt like a fresh start. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine, untouched by the ghosts of our failed marriage. I decorated it with simple things that brought me peace: books, plants, and a few photographs of happier times with family and friends. Work became my sanctuary. I threw myself into projects with renewed focus, taking on challenges I might have avoided in the past. My dedication didn't go unnoticed. Within months, I was offered a promotion, along with a team to manage. For years, I had been overshadowed by Isabella's ambitious persona, constantly feeling like I was playing catch-up. But now, standing on my own, I realized I had my own strengths, ones that didn't need to compete with anyone else's. One evening, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone, images of Isabella and me at family gatherings, vacations, and quiet moments at home stared back at me. There was a time when those memories had felt tainted, but now they seemed distant, like they belonged to someone else's story. I decided to delete most of them, keeping only a few that reminded me of the lessons I'd learned. Not everything about our time together had been bad, but it had shaped who I was now, and I was grateful for the clarity it had brought me. The public fallout from the scandal continued to haunt Isabella and her family. Their once flawless reputation had been irreparably damaged, and their business empire was crumbling. Mutual acquaintances occasionally sent me updates, but I no longer felt invested. Their downfall wasn't my victory. It was simply the natural consequence of their choices. One day, I received a text from an unknown number. It was Isabella. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from," the message read, "but I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." I stared at the screen for a long time, my mind torn between anger and pity. I could imagine the state she was in, desperate, ashamed, and clinging to the hope of reconciliation. But I had moved on, and I had no intention of reopening old wounds. Without responding, I deleted the message and blocked the number. That moment felt like the final act of closure. By not engaging, I was choosing myself over the past, over the pain, over her. It was a small but powerful decision. In time, I began to open myself up to new experiences. I joined a local hiking group, rediscovering my love for nature. I started writing again, something I had abandoned during my marriage. I even went on a few dates, though I wasn't in a rush to find someone new. For now, I was content to focus on myself, learning to enjoy my own company. One evening, while hiking with the group, I met a woman named Claire. She was kind, thoughtful, and had a quiet confidence that drew me in. We talked about everything: our shared love of books, our favorite trails, and the challenges we'd faced in life. There was no pressure, no rush, just two people connecting. As we stood on a hill overlooking the sunset, Claire turned to me and said, "You seem like someone who's been through a lot, but you haven't let it break you." Her words stayed with me. She was right. I had been through hell, but I had come out stronger. The pain of betrayal, the humiliation, the heartbreak. They had all shaped me, but they hadn't defined me. Now, as I sit in my quiet apartment, sipping coffee and planning my next adventure, I realize how far I've come. The life I once shared with Isabella feels like a distant memory, a chapter that I've closed. My story isn't about her anymore. It's about me, my growth, my happiness, my future. And for the first time in years, I'm excited to see what comes next.